All right, welcome back. So I promised I was going to talk about Machiavelli. So let's go ahead and do that. So Machiavelli, what comes to mind when you hear the words Machiavellian? Probably a very scheming sort of person, right? A very diabolical sort of person. Machiavellian politics is said to be the politics of, manipulation and power and not caring what you do to other people, so long as it gets you your advantage. Now, this might be true for sort of, quote, Machiavellian ideas. This might be kind of the right direction to be thinking about it in. But this is not really true of who Machiavelli was as a person. And it's something that gets lost in the discussion about him. So the big quote from Machiavelli that everybody fixates on is the ends justify the means. That you can do whatever you need to in order to get the result that you want. And the other one is it's better to be feared than to be loved. And ideally, you should be both feared and loved. These are from his work called The Prince. So Prince during this time period didn't just mean the son of a king. It meant specifically, or less specifically, any sort of person who was like a ruling figure. So this could include any of the sort of powerful families of the city-states, or it could include like an actual king or a duke or any kind of powerful leader. And so what the Prince was a sort of book of recommendations to these powerful leaders on what they should do and how they should manage their rule. So Machiavelli, he describes these sort of diabolical things that a leader can do, which, things like, do something bad if it leads to a good end, or make the people fear you, things like that. But if we got the impression of Machiavelli that he was a very scheming sort of person, that's an incorrect impression, because he's not really trying to make people worse. In fact, he's trying to make them better. So for context, Machiavelli lived in a time period where the powerful families were quite frightening. And he was specifically in the city of Florence. Now, Florence was run by the Medici family. This was a family that got more and more powerful over time. Different generations of rulers, all in that family of the Medicis. One of them was Cosimo, and then we had Piero, and then finally we had Lorenzo Medici the Magnificent. And all of these guys, I don't know, you can kind of think of them a bit like mob bosses, They had their whole family controlling all this sort of powerful stuff, and if you mess with them, they'd get you. Now, they were also competing with other cities, like Venice and Milan. But Florence had all these bankers. These guys were involved in the banking trade, and so they made money when the bankers made money, and so they were doing very well for themselves. They got the printing press, and they spread knowledge really fast, so good for them on that. And the knowledge sort of moved out away from just being controlled by the church. So they should deserve maybe a little credit for being part of that. But they were also very inherently sort of schemy people. And so Machiavelli shouldn't be as someone who's trying to make them more scheming people, but as someone who's trying to keep them from destroying everything. At this time, Florence was in real danger. If you read Machiavelli's letters to his friends, you see that he was just freaked out all the time. The alliances and the borders were constantly changing due to invading armies. He was very worried that Florence would be taken over, and ultimately he just wanted to survive. He wanted to see it all survive. He had fled from other cities where there had been this sort of destructive violence, and at the same time, there was also more bubonic plague. That's something that people don't talk about often enough, is that the plague wasn't just a thing that happened at the end of the Middle Ages. It happened multiple times and through the Renaissance. And if you think about it, the plague spread because the cities were big and people were living in close quarters. Well, in the Renaissance, the cities were even bigger, so the plague continued to spread. So Machiavelli lived through multiple plagues and a whole bunch of sort of intercity war. And so what he really hoped was that he could get the Medici to sort of steer things in a direction of stability. He would advise them and he would guide them towards something that made everything work. And, he gave up a lot by doing this. I mean, these were people who in the past had tortured him because he ran afoul of them. So that's a big thing to do, to try and, get in good with them and try to make them better and wiser people. But that was what he hoped to do. And so his arguments about better to being feared than to be loved, the ends justify the means, it should be thought of more as a way to sort of give them a path to success. And he thought, if they could have sort of noble and thoughtful government, then they could keep the city from falling apart. And that was what he wanted. Now, that said, when he said this, it was still kind of shocking because all of these leaders, they were virtue guys. They were presenting themselves as, oh, we are so good and we are close to God and we are wise already, when in fact, they were doing underhanded things constantly. And so Machiavelli kind of took the friendly face off it and said, look, just do what you need to do to survive, but make sure that you do survive. And so that's his idea of the ends justify the means. If the city is going to be okay, if the people in it are living good lives, then it doesn't matter what maybe these leaders do to some other city to keep things in shape, keep things in check. So that's how we should understand this. But it was quite shocking, especially because, people didn't really have the idea at the time of just doing things for their end results. This is a kind of debate in philosophy of like, how should actions be judged? And Machiavelli kind of invents the standpoint that they should be judged on their outcomes rather than on whether they are like inherently good actions as some sort of holy, godly way. You don't just donate money to the church because God wants you to, or you don't, dress a certain way because God says it's virtuous. Machiavelli says, oh, you should do whatever is pragmatic and leads to the result you want. So this is kind of the modern philosophy of political realism in a way, that realism, I quote, it may not be all that realistic, but just that a country or a city shouldn't be reluctant to do what it takes to survive, basically. That's political realism for you. So Machiavelli, maybe his philosophy, not what we want to adopt if we want to come from a more sort of peaceful point of view. But I think it's unfair to just see him as a schemer. He clearly was working for something much more than that. But he had to deal with these guys. And so, he had limited resources as to what to work with. Okay, so let's look at some of the artists of the Renaissance. I think, we have some time for artists in this video. So one of them I mentioned was Alberti. So Alberti was an architect, and he was really into the work of ancient architects. There's a particularly famous Roman architect, Vitruvius, who Alberti was one of the ones who kind of rediscovered his work. And Alberti wrote his own book based on Vitruvius's book and said, this is Roman principles that we can all adopt, and this is my strategy for doing them. And in practice, this is why the Renaissance tends to be a time period where lots of architecture based on the work of Roman architecture comes back. If you sort of dare to compare here, we've got some of the same sort of Roman stuff. For instance, Corinthian columns. This is the Pantheon from ancient Rome, still one of the most impressive buildings that's survived mostly intact. It has these style of columns. Well, Alberti does it here too, except he embeds them into the wall and he flattens them out. And columns that you do that with are known as pilasters. He also has the sort of triangular roof here, and he has the arches that were so important in Roman architecture, leading to vaults. Vaults is when you kind of make a roof out of arches like we're doing here. And this building basically feels like you're walking into a temple, but in fact, it's not a temple, it's a church. So the Church of Saint Andrea was based on these Roman principles. And that was how Alberti tended to roll. Now, another thing about the Pantheon is that it is famous for its dome. It had a dome, which was one of the most impressive creations of the ancient world. Building domes is hard. You can kind of figure it out once you've got arches because it's kind of based on the same principles of strength, but still it's hard to make them so that they don't fall in. Well, in this time period, we're going to bring back domes. Filippo Brunelleschi Brunelleschi brought back the dome in a big way. In fact, he broke records with it. This is a new church. A cathedral that was built during this time has one of the most impressive domes that had ever been seen, bigger than anything that the Romans had done. And he developed wholly new architect techniques in order to make this dome work. He did things like have a sort of screw that had a platform on it and could be raised and lowered to move people and parts of the building up and down. And so this took a lot of time to construct, but when it was done, it was a very, respected monument. And let me get the name of the cathedral right here, if you'll bear with me just a second here. Yes, so this is the cathedral in Florence. That's what I thought. This is the cathedral in Florence. And the official name of it, I guess, is just Florence Cathedral. Okay, that's why I couldn't remember it. It's just the Cathedral of Florence. And Brunelleschi, created a monument that would last and that would beautify this same city. It's a pretty spectacular city, it's had Machiavelli and all the things the Medicis can do, and Brunelleschi as well. Okay, so let's see. Okay, I'm gonna leave off here and then I'll pick up and we'll talk about Renaissance art and painting in the next one. And then that will probably be where we finish off.